Hi, my name is Joetta Reed, and I'm here to discuss my findings from my original research study that I conducted for my senior project at Youngstown State University. For my research, I looked at communication styles and strategies and how they can be used to diffuse crisis situations on like a public relations standpoint. So to start my research, I looked at several different articles about different public relations crises and like how they were handled, what styles for communications they used. I looked at a study from Hong and Book-young in 2018 that talked about narrative tones, conversational tones, and how they work in a crisis situation. They defined narrative tone as the attitude or emotion an organization wants to share with the public. This means what they want you to see is how they're going to come across for their responses in a crisis. They also define conversational tone as the human voice or more natural speaking. So like if you were having a conversation with someone, the tone you're using with them is how your post is going to come across. And then I looked at a study by Kim and Park in 2017 that discussed accommodation strategies and different communication strategies for public relations crises. They looked at accommodation strategies, which they defined as taking responsibility for a crisis and reacting to fix it. Defensive strategies, which they defined as the crisis isn't happening or the organization isn't at fault. And then they had denial strategies, which are there's nothing happening, there's not a situation, they're not involved. I also looked at source credibility because in a crisis situation, having a credible source to talk to the public is detrimental. It's going to make or break how they respond. Source credibility is defined as how factual and trustworthy a source is. Sources are more credible coming from an organization member or spokesperson rather than a third-party source. That was what Van Zuzen and Vandermeer found in 2015. So after looking at this research and seeing how others looked at crisis situations and how to respond to them, I asked, does the narrative tone used with accommodation strategy make for the best handled public relations crisis? And I looked at, I hypothesized, do accommodation strategies coming from an organization are the most effective way to handle a crisis situation? To find answers to this research question and my hypothesis, I did a survey. So I did a convenient online survey, and from my survey I got 182 responses. 59% of them were women, 40% were men, and all their respondents' average age was 23. So what I did was the survey was online, it was a questionnaire. It included a crisis scenario, which you can see here, and it included 2 responses, which are there and there. The crisis was a fire situation on campus, and there were 2 responses. The one on Facebook being a accommodative conversational style, and the one on Twitter being an accommodative narrative style. After looking at those, I asked the respondents to look at the scenario and the responses to the scenario and answer questions based on the scenario. The questions asked about how the situation was handled, if it was a crisis, if they thought the organization was at fault for the crisis. They were also asked which form of social media they thought addressed the situation better, whether it was Facebook or Twitter. So the questions were, all of them but the Facebook or Twitter question were asked on a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree. So the situation, after looking at my results, was seen as a crisis, but the situation was seen as handled well and that the responses felt honest. So the results for this were somewhat surprising, but somewhat what I expected. Because some of the results contradicted what past research showed, and I thought, after reading past research, I thought it was pretty sound, but looking at my research, it was not the same. So for when handling a crisis, accommodation strategies are the most effective way to respond. The average answer to the situation being handled well was positive. So accommodation strategies did work for handling the crisis situation. Very few responses felt that the statements from the organization didn't make it any better. But overall, it was almost a 4 out of 5 disagreed that it was handled well and that the accommodation strategies made the situation better. And then, does a narrative tone used with an accommodation strategy make for the best handled public relations crisis? Well, 58% of the respondents chose the conversational accommodation response over the 42 that chose the narrative conversation response, or the narrative accommodation response. So, which is contradictory to the study that Hong and Bukyong did in 2018, where they found that narrative tone was more effective than conversational tone. To discuss, social media responses during a crisis situation can make or break the company or organization's image. As you can see here, if you were to look at this situation and they were to have denied it, they would have been seen as at fault. People would have been in outrage. Why aren't they doing more? So if you accommodate for a situation, it's going to be better for your organization overall if you make the accommodations. You're going to be seen as a good company, and it's not going to be remembered as a crisis because you handled it correctly. Accommodative strategies are effective in diffusing the crisis situation, and a conversational tone may be the best option. The organization in my study was seen as not at fault by 62% of respondents, showing that accommodation strategies do work. There were some limitations to this research. I was limited by only getting 182 responses, and they were just from YSU classes, which I did focus my study around YSU, so that was less of a limitation, but it was still limited because I only had 182 responses. I only had college students responding, so I didn't have any way to know if parents thought differently, or if people outside of the Youngstown State community felt differently about the situation. I also only had, as the average age of my respondent was 23, I only had a young group of people taking this survey, and their answers probably would have been a little bit different than older people taking it, because their social media usage is different. So they would have thought that the responding that way might not have been the best way to respond. To conclude, accommodation strategies are the best option for how to handle public relations crisis if you want not to be remembered as a crisis. A conversational tone makes people feel more at ease, and it allows for you to give a more personal touch to your responses. You also want to make sure you're responding from your organization with a spokesperson from your organization, not from someone as a third party, because if you use a third party, it's not felt as honest, or it can be felt as cold. I found a lot to be interesting with this research, because my research personally did not line up with what I thought it was going to, as I said before. And so for me to have found, even with my limited research amount, or respondent amount, to find that accommodation strategies with a conversational tone to be more effective than a narrative tone was surprising to me, because I really did think it was going to be found that a narrative tone was more effective. And I think that's all I have to say. Thanks for listening.